Hello everyone, my name is Ben Crawshaw. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedules to join us today. Hey, you work in the church world in any context, I know that you're busy because the demands of people, the things that you feel like you should be doing, you have a life, your personal schedule, all of that is, fighting for your time and attention, and you have taken time out of that very busy schedule to join us today. And here's what I love is that in the day and age of technology, we can put on an event like this and you don't have to, get a plane ticket, rent a hotel room, get a rental car, pay all that money, sit next to strangers that you don't want to make awkward conversation with, right? You can kind of be in the comfort of your own office or your own home and join us for this event. And I think that's awesome. And we're calling this event Thrive, and I can move the slides with an iPhone. How cool is that? Okay, speaking of technology, I just love it. So a blueprint for growing and organizing your church in 2018. Really, as we plan ahead, or maybe you're already into 2018 as you're watching this, we want to help you get organized, but really, we just want to help you succeed in any way that we can. We want to see your church thrive in any context that we possibly can help you, because we love churches. We love small churches, big churches. We love church leaders, and we just want to do what we can to serve you, but really we want to see you thrive. As I mentioned later, my name's Ben, Director of Content at the Rocket Company, written a couple books. I've been working with churches since 1998. Wow, it's been a long time. I love small churches, although we all have a different definition of what a small church is, right? I'll let you guys argue over that. I'm passionate about helping church leaders move forward and really just love being around church leaders, learning from you guys, stealing your ideas, putting them together and sharing them with other people, right? Because you're in the trenches doing this week after week, and you're mobilizing volunteers and you're seeing, okay, that worked, that didn't work as well, but this has really, really worked. Procuring that kind of stuff and sharing it with other church leaders. I love to do that. We have an early offer for those of you who are jumping in today, and it's Preaching Rocket. You're saying, what in the world is Preaching Rocket? It's like a mixture of theology and, space technology, right? No, Preaching Rocket is a resource, a compiled resource. It's a revolutionary step-by-step system designed to take the stress and worry out of creating powerful sermons each week. Now, why would we talk about stress and worry when it comes to creating powerful sermons each week? Because we've been there. Because we've been there. And it's like, wow, we had one or two powerful sermons, but we have to do this the rest of the year, or most Sundays of this year, we have to come up with another sermon to prepare and to preach to our congregation. That creates a lot of stress and worry. Knowing how to prepare, how to get organized, what to talk about, how to make these talks stick with people in a way that they remember them. I don't have to convince you guys who communicate week after week. Yeah, there's some stress and worry there. That's why Preaching Rocket was created. Now, how it works, it's 12 modules of online learning with easy-to-follow video, audio, and text-based training. And again, what's awesome about this is through the power of technology, you can access this content on the go, where you are. You can share it with a team. You can watch it with other communicators that you want to develop. And you can learn from people out there who are in the trenches, sharing things that they've learned over years of experience when it comes to preaching. So it's like seminary. For those of you who went to seminary, you learn from these men who've been studying theology their whole life, and that's incredible. What Preaching Rocket is, you learn from people who week after week have been practically trying to engage people, insiders and outsiders, in their congregations week after week. And that's what Preaching Rocket brings to you. What seminary brings to you from a theology standpoint, Preaching Rocket brings to you from a practical application standpoint week after week when it comes to your preaching. So I think you'll be encouraged and thrilled by how quickly Preaching Rocket can improve your sermon preparation process. And we'll talk more about this. We all know that preparing week after week, that's the grind of preaching. I think Preaching Rocket will really help. We're going to throw in a free bonus. We'll talk about that later today, but it'll be 53% off of $1,994. That's a lot of math there, worth of incredible church growth resources. You can click the offer in the chat box or go to thrivethisyear.com. Again, that's thrivethisyear.com. You can get started for $79. Click the link in the chat stream or sign up here, thrivethisyear.com. So with that being said, I want to jump into our content. Again, we talked about Thrive. It's a blueprint for growing and organizing your church in 2018. And so what I want to do right now is invite Jeff Henderson to come over here and have a seat beside me. Jeff, you can come on over and have a seat.
See, Ben?
See, I have learned the power of a sports coat from Jeff Henderson. But see, now you're throwing me off because you've added
the pocket square.
The pocket square.
I'll bring you a pocket square for Thrive too.
I'm always just one step behind you, Jeff.
Well, as Ben said, thanks so much for joining us for Thrive and carving out time to do what's really, really important. We can all get better. And so we hope today is going to be a help to you and your church. That we think about and we believe, and we think this is just at the heart of the gospel, is one of the ways that we grow and God grows our churches is through preaching. And so we're going to talk about reaching through preaching and why this is really, really important. And what Gavin's going to talk about, and what Ben has been talking about, what I'm going to try to talk about, really is at the heart of the gospel. And you know this, in Luke 14, Jesus tells this amazing story. He goes to this dinner party, which gets very awkward very quickly because Jesus starts confronting the people at this dinner party. But then he tells this parable, and you know the parable, it's about the master who wants people to come into their house, to his house rather, and so he sends a servant out to this group of people, and then he sends the servant out to this group of people, and the servant comes back and says, "What you have ordered, master, what you've ordered has been done, but there's still room in the house for more people." And in Luke chapter 14, verse 23, this is what the master, who the master is symbolized by our Heavenly Father. That's who is playing the role of our Heavenly Father. He said, "Then the master told his servant, go out to the roads and the country lanes," I love that, "and compel them to come in so that my house will be full." And so there's this desire on the part of our Heavenly Father that his kingdom would be full of his children. And that's why what we're talking about is so important. So we're going to talk about reaching through preaching today, and Gavin's going to talk about how we do this. But ultimately, what we're doing is just trying to be obedient to Luke chapter 14, verse 23. We want to go out into the highways and the country roads and compel people to come into the kingdom of God. And we're going to talk about some ways that God is blessing and can bless your church to do that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just basically this. The church, when it comes to Luke 14, the church is God's instrument to fulfill the story in Luke 14 and fulfill the commandment in verse 23. And preaching is one of the most significant tools God uses to help make this happen. It's a gift, it's a responsibility, and the fact that you're watching this shows that you're very interested in being a good steward of the preaching talent that God has given you. And I grew up a preacher's kid, Ben grew up a preacher's kid, and I remember seeing my dad preach, and when I saw my dad preach, I could just sense, even as a young age, I could sense something was happening in the room. And what that I would later begin to understand as I got older is that my Heavenly Father was taking the words of my earthly father and applying them to the hearts of the people at this church, his church, and significant life change was happening. That's what we get to do in our roles as pastors and preachers. The other important reason for this is that while we're talking about Thrive is every number has a name. So when the master of the house said, go out in the highways and the country roads and bring more and more people in. Yeah, he was talking numbers, but every number has a name. So the reason we're doing Thrive, the reason we're interested in church growth is because every number has a name, and it's at the heart of our Heavenly Father to bring more and more people into the kingdom. The reality, though, is that it's just not that easy. We have so many other things that are coming our way as pastors and preachers. I mean, one of the problems is we just have too many details to handle. Totally understand that. Similarly, here's another one. How do I preach to both church and unchurched people? So how do I do this? How do I preach to people that already know what Luke 14 is and people that have no idea who Luke is, right? They think Luke is a country music star. They have no idea anywhere in the gospel, who is this guy? How do I preach and reach people who are trying to grow in their faith and don't have faith? We're going to talk about this, but this is a challenge, all right? Another one is you need to lead the staff. And many of you would say, Jeff, I are the staff, all right? It's just me. Totally understand that. But we could talk about core volunteers or teams of people or team of volunteers. Your core, you have to lead them, okay? Whether it's paid staff or volunteers. The other time is it just takes time to minister to others, right? I mean, it's not just, you just don't have all the sermon prep time in the world. You have to have time to minister to others. And then here's a great question. How can we reach people in our community who don't know Jesus through our preaching? All right, so there's all these challenges, all these questions. So that said, here are the 4 things I want to walk us through as it relates to reaching through preaching. We're going to talk about these issues. We're going to talk about preaching to the lost and found. How do you do that? Then we're going to talk about something that's really, really important, and you know this, it's sermon prep, okay? And I know every preacher on the planet would agree with this, that if we had more time to prepare, we would preach better, okay? We're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about finding your voice, okay? You have a specific voice, and in Preaching Rocket, we teach you how to find that voice, and your voice has a strength, and your voice also has a weakness, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk about becoming a better illustrator, okay? So we're going to, how can you illustrate your messages in other ways, just in words coming out of our mouth, all right? So that's what we're going to talk about. So let's start first with preaching to the lost and found, okay? So when it comes to unchurched people and churched people, there's something that both of those groups, the lost and the found, have in common, and that is that unchurched and churched people are people, okay? And so they have a lot more in common, and really in many respects, than there are differences. So one of the things we wanted to lean into, and we did this as we started creating Preaching Rocket, is what are the similarities here? In other words, when you preach to people in your church, those who do know Jesus and those who don't, there's actually some similarities between those two. And if you can lean into those common ground and that similarities, it actually helps. So we actually did some research not too long ago, and we actually asked unchurched people and churched people these questions. What is the ideal length of a sermon? What topics would you want to hear about? And what distractions do you face while listening? Okay? Now, all of this is really, really important as it relates and ties into your sermon prep, okay? Because one of the things with sermon prep that is really, really important is this, and let me explain this because this may sound confusing at first. But while your sermon prep should start with the Bible, your sermon might not need to start there. Let me say that again. While your sermon prep should start with the Bible, your sermon might not need to start there. What I mean by that is that you want to be able to create some common ground with people, whether they believe in the Bible or not, whether they know who Jesus is or not. You want them to be shaking their head going, oh, I can agree with it. I relate to that. That's funny. Or I've been there. I totally understand that. In the first few minutes of your message, you want people to be going, oh, yeah, I'm so glad I came today. Even if they don't believe in any of this stuff, even if this is their first time there, you want them to go, wow, I like him. I like her. I can relate to him. I can relate to her. So in the first few minutes of our sermon, if we go right to the passage and dive into what Luke was saying, we can take people, some people on the journey, and we can leave some people behind, okay? So that's the first part of your message really has to start with some common ground. The other thing, to go back to the questions we asked, is what is the ideal length of a sermon? We asked both groups of people, and what's so fascinating is that they were almost the same. There wasn't this gigantic difference. In fact, unchurched people said, here's what I think the ideal length of a sermon is. And here's what church people said the ideal length of a sermon is. Unchurched people, 24 minutes. Churched people, 30 minutes. All right? Unchurched people said 24 minutes. Church people, 30 minutes. I think it's fascinating that this wasn't a huge discrepancy. You didn't have church people going, I just want an hour and a half sermon. Can you give me more of that? So what's interesting about this is we can argue this and say this is wrong, they should want more, but it is what it is. So we can argue against this, or we can craft our sermons around that, all right? Now, here's why this is so important. If we jam in a lot of information and try to get into this and try to fit it all in 30 minutes, there's a challenge to that, okay? And I love what Herbert Simon, a preacher from a few years ago, said. He said, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. In other words, the way to say this is, your goal is not to fill the time. Your goal is to leverage the time, all right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a second. The other question we asked people in this survey was, how do you want to feel after a sermon, all right? And we could say, Jeff, we don't care about how people feel. I think that's a wrong approach. I think there's an emotion that we want people to be leaving with after we preach. And what's interesting is that the top choice to this answer, the top choice for church and unchurched and church was the same. I think this goes back to the fact we said earlier, unchurched people and church people are people. They have a lot more in common than we would actually think. And the fact that they would answer this question the same is just very, very informative, I think, as you think about how to prepare for your next sermon. So the top choice in terms of how do I want to feel after a sermon was this one. I want to feel challenged to be better. That's good, all right? And I want to feel closer to God. Now, don't miss this. People who had not been to church more than once in the last 5 years, that's kind of how we characterized it, they still came in wanting you and me to challenge them to be better at life. There's something in most of us that we want to be better as a leader, better as a dad or a mom, better as a husband or a wife, better as with our finances. There's something about us that we want to be better. And then if there really is a God, don't forget, they've actually come to church. If there really is a God, they want to know, how can I feel closer to God? So these are two emotions to lean into as you think about crafting your sermon. And again, this is so fascinating to me. This is both churched and unchurched people. Now, the other thing in terms of topics, what topic would you like most to hear addressed in the sermon? What do you want to hear about? This was interesting. 46% of people in the survey prefer more application-oriented sermons. In other words, they want us to help them answer this question at the end of our sermon. And this is a great question to ask in any sermon, is what do you want people to do? I mean, just because it's true doesn't mean it might not, that it's automatically helpful, okay? So what do you want people to do? And this was quite alarming when we discovered this in this survey. Only 9% of people said their behavior has been impacted by a sermon. That's a little discouraging. Only 9% of people said their behavior has been impacted by a sermon. And my hunch is because we've gotten up and we've shared truth, but many times we haven't told them how to apply this truth. It's not enough to stand up and say, this is the truth. You have to take the truth and make it applicable in everyday life, okay? Now, the other challenge for all this, as we heard, is we asked this question, which was a little alarming: do you multitask during a sermon, okay? Almost half said yes. So they're listening to you, they're doing the grocery list in their mind, they might be on Twitter, they might be checking their phone. 49% say they're multitasking, which means your job and my job is increasingly difficult to try to capture their attention. The other thing is 70% give a preacher 3 minutes or less to gain their attention. So when you stand up there, the first 3 to 5 minutes, it's holy ground. And if you don't capture the attention and take them on a journey, it's hard to capture them midway or to the end. So we teach you in Preaching Rocket why that first 5 to 10 minutes is so important. And that's one of the reasons we actually created Preaching Rocket. And another favorite preacher of mine, Martin Lloyd-Jones, said this. I love this. He said, I felt that in preaching, the first thing you had to do was demonstrate to the people that what you were going to do was very relevant and urgently important. I love that. I love that. And it really goes back to this: what do you want people to do? Now, not only that, here's the thing we've also discovered, is that when it comes to sermons, keep it short, keep it simple. Keep it short, keep it simple. And, you know, I think sometimes we would push back against this because we want to go really deep and we want to preach long. But again, I think that's one of the reasons why only 9% of people have said in this survey, I don't think, a sermon's really not impacting my behavior. So when you keep it short and when you keep it simple and when you have a call to action or call to application, people remember that and can begin to apply that into their life. That's why this is why this is so true. Action is better than theory. Action is better than theory. So why is all this important? Well, we're talking about how to preach to both the lost and found. We're talking about how to preach to the unchurched and the church people in the room. But as we've said, there's a lot of similarities between these two groups because they're actually human beings. They're looking for an emotion. They want to feel challenged to be better at life. They want to have an emotion that they know that they can get closer to God. All of this is at our disposal. And then if we can teach them what to do and apply this truth to their lives, then that's one of the ways that you reach both the lost and the found and preach to both of those groups. And that's what we teach you at Preaching Rocket, and we can lead you to do that. And that's why I think preaching is one of the tools that God uses to fulfill the command in Luke 14, verse 23. Now, the other thing we're going to talk about is sermon prep, all right? And here's the counterintuitive thing about sermon prep. It takes more time to preach shorter messages, all right? It takes more time to preach shorter messages. And here's my hunch. I'm a preacher's kid. I don't know how many sermons I've heard, but I can tell quickly or not if a preacher is prepared. And typically I can tell by how long the sermon is. Because what happens is if a preacher's not prepared, they'll find their point about minute 22 or 23, they'll get so excited about it and preach another 30 minutes, okay? They're just not prepared. And here's the thing that we have to remember. is that the people in your church can tell if you're prepared or not as well, all right? And I'll never forget my dad one time telling me, son, you have to be prepared. If not, what you do is you dishonor the people who got up to come hear the sermon that day, and you also dishonor God by not being a good steward of the gift. You have to be prepared. Now, it's not that easy. That's one of the reasons we created Preaching Rocket. And I know, I saw my dad had to preach 3 original sermons every week. Sunday night, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. I don't know how he did it. So our goal at Preaching Rocket is to help you get 5 days ahead, and we teach you how to do this. And just imagine this. If you can get 5 days ahead in your sermon, it will be a huge difference, not only to the church, not only to your ministry, but to your personal and emotional health as well. And so here's what we lean into. The better you prepare, the better you preach. The better you prepare, the better you preach. And the more you prepare, the more concise and the shorter the messages get. It takes longer time to prepare shorter messages. I love this quote from President Woodrow Wilson. This is what he said when someone asked him about his message prep. He said, if I'm to speak 10 minutes, I need a week of preparation. If 15 minutes, 3 days. If half an hour, 2 days. If an hour, I'm ready now. What he's illustrating here is, hey, if you give me a long time to talk, I can talk right now. But if the shorter you want me to talk, the more time I need to prepare. This isn't just true for presidents, it's true for preachers. And so that's why we're excited you're watching Thrive, that you're part of the Preaching Rocket community. This is what we do. You love to preach, but we help you prepare. And the great thing I love about this is that we've been doing this for so many years. And I talk to so many of you when I'm out and around the country, and you have come up and you've shared with me how your preaching has gotten better just with these few ways and strategies to help you prepare. So here's how this works. Let me show you how this works and how we teach you how to do this. To get 5 days ahead, Monday, we have these questions, all right? And these questions help you with your sermon content, and they help you find the tension or the interesting point in your message. And then Tuesday, we have these boxes that we ask you to fill in that basically are the answers to the questions that we give you. And then Wednesday, you write a rough draft and you email it to someone, all right? And it might not be completely done, but on Wednesday, you're ahead of the game, and somebody has, that could be your spouse, it could be somebody on your team, they have the rough outline of your message. Now, here's why this is important. When you have this rough outline, and we walk you through how all to do this, it's like putting it in a crock pot and letting it simmer for a while. And it's now, you've put it in the crock pot on Wednesday, and now it begins to simmer, and you don't take it out of the crock pot until Sunday. Versus, many of us, let me push this, many of us don't start our sermon prep until Friday, 2 days before Sunday, okay? That's like microwaving. Put it in the microwave and trying to microwave your points. But if you crock pot it on Wednesday, what will happen is you'll go out to eat, and the waitress or waiter will come over and say something, and you'll go, I can put that in my message. You have opportunities for the message to grow and to craft versus just starting on Friday, all right? Now, I know many of you say, well, Jeff, I've got to preach 48 times a year, all right? Well, one of the questions I would ask you is, how many Sundays can you preach great messages in a year? And just because the calendar says that you have to preach 48 times doesn't mean that that's the number of great sermons that you can preach. You may say, you know, ultimately I think I can only preach 35, all right? Then your goal is to preach 35 great sermons. Then have other people come in and preach those sermons. Bring video in, doesn't matter. But how many great sermons can you preach in a year and do this system? Then on Thursday, what you do is you make it better. You get your notes back out. Again, it's in the crock pot. And here's another thing we challenge in Preaching Rocket. Never preach your first draft. Never preach your first draft. It should be, you know, a few drafts in before you get up on a Sunday. Then on Friday, here's one of the things we encourage you to do is just get up and say this thing out loud. All right? Just rehearse it and say it. It could be in a closet. It could be a room by yourself, but say it out loud. And then here's my favorite part. On Saturday, go to the park, go to the ball games, go and hang out with your family. One of the promises we give you at Preaching Rocket is we give you back to your family on Saturday. Now, you might think, well, Jeff, I think this is a little irresponsible. Shouldn't I be working on my sermon on Saturday? Nope, you're resting because the sermon's already done, but it's still in the crock pot simmering in you. And when you go to the park, when you go out hang out with your family, when you're out with your spouse, when you're just doing life, it actually gets better because you're resting, all right? Now, if you followed this process through, It will help you be a better preacher. Now, you might ask, well, what are the 4 questions? Well, here are the 4 questions, and we don't have time to go through all of this today, but the 4 questions, you've got your passage. Let's say it's Luke 14. You kind of know where you're going. Obviously, you're all prayed up. That's all a given. And then the first question is, what does my audience think? What does my audience think about the topic? What does my audience think about what's going on in the world? It could just be a general, what does my audience think? Then what do I want my audience to think? By the way, this is where most sermons start. And that's not where you want to start your sermon, all right? You want to get there, but you don't want to start with that. You want to start with a connecting point. Then what is my single most persuasive idea, and what do I want them to do, which is what we talked about a little earlier. Now, one of the things we teach is how you craft and content and develop the answers to these questions. But when you have the answers to these questions, we then ask you to do what we call build the box. So the questions of what do I want my audience to do would go in here, or what does my audience think? Then, what do I want my audience to think? And my single most persuasive idea goes in this box. And then you end with the application. What do I want them to do? And remember, this is what they're wanting. They're wanting to feel challenged to be better at life. They're wanting to feel an emotion that they're closer to God. So you take the answers to those questions, you plot them in. Then on Friday, you get up and you just say this. And then when you get up, you have a picture of your sermon in your mind. So you don't need a podium. If you want to have a screen, that's awesome. But you don't need the whole thing manuscript because you've internalized it, because you can see a picture. Everything that goes in this first box, what does my audience currently think? What is the tension? What is the challenge I want to give them? How do I want to connect with them? Then here's the answer. I've created a problem. I've created a solution here. This is what the Bible says about it. And here's what we're going to do this week as it relates to our time together. So that's a snapshot of how I think you can help get better at sermon prep, because the better you prepare, the better you preach. Now, so that said, here's the 2 things we've already covered. How do you preach to the lost and found? And then how do you get better at sermon prep? And how do we help you do that at Preaching Rocket? But the other thing that we talked about is finding your voice, all right? Finding your voice. I want to talk about how you do this. And there are 4 different voices that I've observed over the years of watching preachers and working with preachers. And this is true for business communicators as well. There may be more voices, I don't know. But generally speaking, there's the voice of the teacher, the voice of the motivator, the voice of the storyteller, and the voice of the visionary. And each one of these has a strength, and each one of these has a weakness. So let me talk to you real quickly about which one of these are and how this works. And then at Preaching Rocket, we teach you how to discover which one of these voices you might have. Now, you might say, well, Jeff, I think I might have 2 of these voices. You might. But I would have a tendency to think that one probably overshadows the other, maybe just a little bit, okay? So let's start with teacher. You might have the voice of the teacher. The strength of a teacher is content. You know your content. You're passionate about your content. You love your content. We've had school teachers that will get up there, and they're passionate about biology. You've had preachers. They're passionate about the Word of God. That's fantastic. So they've got content, and the teachers ask, I don't know how I'm going to get all of this information in an hour, because there's just so much great content. Okay, so the strength of the teacher is the content. But with every strength, as you know, there's a corresponding weakness. And the corresponding weakness for the voice of the teacher is connection. We've all had teachers, whether it's a school teacher, business speaker, or pastor or preacher, who are so passionate about their content. They have great content, but in the first 5 or 10 minutes, they don't connect with us, and they don't give us a reason to listen. They just assume that because they're interested in the content, that we will be interested in the content, and they lose the audience in the first 5 or 10 minutes, and they're never able to gain them back. So one of the things we teach in Preaching Rocket is how to avoid that. Now, the voice of the motivator is the exact opposite. They can get up there, and he or she can instantly gain the attention of the crowd. They're charismatic. They can motivate a crowd. But the challenge with the motivator is the opposite of the teacher, in the sense that they can actually not have great content. They can engage the crowd for the first 5 minutes, but then they start skimping on the content. And it's heavy connection and light content. And part of the reason for that is many motivators don't do the work of message prep or sermon prep. So motivator and teacher are the opposite. Now, as it relates to storyteller, the strength of the storyteller is engagement. They can engage you. They take you on a journey. You're so interested in their stories. They're just great. They're funny. They're just so engaging. But the problem with storytellers, the weakness of storytellers, is purpose and direction. And what I mean by that is if you just get up and you're a great storyteller and you have absolutely really no purpose or strategy, but you're engaging the audience, because the audience is engaged, you can tend to think that you've given a successful message. But if all you have done is gotten up there and shared compelling stories, but no one knows what to do with those stories, then that's a fail. So one of the things you have to do as a storyteller is occasionally in your message say, I'm telling you this story for this reason, and tell them the reason why you're talking about this particular story. If you can connect your gift with storytelling with purpose and direction, here's why this story is important and it will help you with your life, and here's what I want you to do, that's a game changer if you have this voice. The final voice is the voice of the visionary. And the strength of the visionary is purpose. We're going to change the world. Here's where we're going. Come follow me, okay? But the weakness of the visionary, and this happens so often in the political world, the weakness is we're going to change the world, but there aren't any details that they provide there. So what happens is over time, it just sounds like rhetoric. And people go, yeah, we've heard this before, but now how are we going to change the world? And how are we going to get clean water over there? And how are we going to reach people in our community for Christ? Can you give me some details? That doesn't mean you have to have all the details ironed out, but you got to have a few. But if you have the voice of the visionary and you can say, hey, here's how we're going to change our world, and here's the first few steps we're going to do that, and here's how we're going to do it. Will you come help me do this? Because if we do this, we'll help change the world. That's a game changer as it relates to this voice. So here's what I want to encourage you to do. Take a look at these four voices. And whether you join the Preaching Rocket community or not, one of the things you should do is ask people around you, ask people who watch you, ask people who listen to you, which one of these voices do you think most resonates with my style as a communicator? And please understand this, none of these voices are right or wrong. They're just a strength. They're just a talent that God has given you. But now that you know which one of these voices you might have, your stewardship responsibility is to take this, leverage the strength of it, and work around the weakness so that you can leverage the voice of the teacher, leverage the voice of the motivator, storyteller, visionary. And if you do this, what happens is you lean into your own style and your own gifting. You don't have to be anyone else than who God has crafted you to be. But if you're going to do that, you're going to have to understand your talent and gifting. And this is why we talk about this a lot in Preaching Rocket as well. Finally, and then I'm going to bring Ben back up, and then we're going to let you see the star of the show, Gavin Adams, here. Here's what we're going to talk about to close out, and then I'll bring Ben up. Here's what we teach at Preaching Rocket as well. We want you to become a better preacher by becoming a better illustrator, okay? And it's not just enough to say words out of your mouth. I mean, Jesus was a master at this. He would tell stories. He would paint pictures. He would heal people by spitting on dirt and rubbing mud in their eyes, all of this tactile stuff. Now, that wasn't just because it was cute and interesting. I think Jesus knew something that we just recently discovered about our brains, all right? And here's what's really, really important as a preacher. One of the things you have to understand about all the brains that are listening to you is that the brain is basically a lazy processor, all right? So what the brain is trying to do, the brain is trying to conserve as much energy as it possibly can. That's what it's trying to do. When you speak and people listen, the brain starts spending a lot of energy out at that moment. So one of the things that will help all the brains in your room connect and rest is when you show them a visual. And when you show them a visual, the brain relaxes and is able to take in the information. I think that's one of the reasons Jesus talked in visuals so much. I think it's one of the reasons Abraham Lincoln spoke in stories and visuals so much. So what do I mean by doing this in terms of becoming a better preacher, by becoming a better illustrator? So one of the principles we have at Preaching Rocket is don't just say it, show it. So I did a message recently at our church that the bottom line was how you view life drives how you do life. And so I just didn't want to say that. I wanted to show it. So I showed them the Viewmaster in the Toy Hall of Fame. And basically I said, we all have a filter in life, right? So we all have a view. We all view life. But what you put in the filter of your view of life will really drive how you do life, okay? So if you view life like everybody's out against you, if you view life with anger, if you view life with envy, if you view life with jealousy, that's your filter. And that filter will drive how you do life. What God wants to invite you to do is to view life through faith in Him. And what would that look like if you actually viewed life through faith in Him? Because how you view life drives how you do life. Now, this thing was so fun. I played with this thing the whole entire time. But what's happening is, as you do this visual, as you do this, every brain is relaxing, according to brain research, and they're taking the bottom line in. How you view life drives how you do life. So the question we ask is really simple. How can you show your message? How can you not just say your message? How can you show your message? So with that, I'm going to bring Ben back in. Ben, welcome back.
Well, thank you, Jeff. That is an incredible bottom line. It's an incredible illustration, and I'm going to steal it. I'm going to give you no credit for it, okay? I'm going to just be like, hey, guys, I just came up with this illustration for you this week. So I'm going to give you guys permission to do that as well. So I'm going to ask you guys, would you like to improve in all areas of your preaching? Everybody would obviously say yes, because it feels like, Jeff, you get your prep is getting better, and then all of a sudden you're like, man, I need to work on my delivery. Mm-hmm. Like one of the things that you encouraged me to do was to watch myself on video, and that was a terrible experience.
It's so painful, and I hate doing that, but you know, it's evaluated experience and evaluated practice helps you get better. Practice doesn't make you better. Evaluated practice makes you get better.
And that's why we talk about all the different areas of improving your preaching. And we talk about a lot of stuff in Preaching Rocket. That's why Preaching Rocket is not a 1 or 2 module program.
Right.
That's why there's 12, and there probably could have been 30 of them.
Well, and it's why we drip it to you, you know, in terms of take this and work on it. You know, that's how athletes get better. You know, it's one thing at a time. So, and there's different places where you are. Some of you are just starting out. Some of you have been doing this for 25 years. We can all get better, for sure.
Yeah, we had a customer from Preaching Rocket who said, I've been preaching how many years, and this is the best resource I'd seen. What has he said, like 49 years he had been preaching?
Yeah.
That's incredible. So Preaching Rocket has worked for all types of communicators, and you know, even people in the business space who are communicating to other audiences, or nonprofits, people who communicate in the community, churches of all sizes. There's some mega churches that have benefited from Preaching Rocket, and churches that are, the set up, tear down, and they have 12 people who are showing up. We've all been there too, traditional preachers as well as non-traditional preachers. So there may be bits and pieces of these that look different depending on the style of church that you're in. But if you're in a church and you're preaching verse by verse, well, you still have to look at a verse and decide, okay, how am I going to bring this point to life? And how am I going to talk about this verse or this passage in a way that people will remember this week?
Yeah, that's not an excuse to, I'm just verse by verse, so I don't have to prepare. And you know that. That's not new information. But praying, prepping, and stories and being prepared. But the other thing, the reason we want you to be prepared is so that you're able to have a life outside of ministry.
Right.
So that we can give you back to your family and give you back to life. And we believe that the better you are emotionally, the better you're going to be as a preacher. That emotional health, and that's a tough thing for many preachers because of the weight of ministry. So that's why one of the reasons we created this, we wanted there to be more healthy, emotionally healthy preachers.
Right, and it's not that we're saying you have to preach the way that we're advocating that you preach, but we want you to have a healthier home life and less burnout. Man, just that's why we want you to thrive, not just from a church standpoint, but emotionally and with your family. So here's what you're going to get when you jump into Preaching Rocket. All of these modules, from building a great sermon, dealing with criticism, preaching calendar. That's a huge one. That's module 4, preaching to the unchurched. We mentioned that. Module 6, we talked about the crucial first 5 minutes. Jeff alluded to that earlier. Then preaching that elicits a response. Goes on from there. I'll let you read through those. Even module 10, how to create a preaching dream team. And Jeff, you mentioned this. Mm-hmm. How many Sundays a year can you be your best? And so Preaching Rocket is a great tool for developing other communicators around you.
Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the things that we all need to be doing as lead pastors, is developing a team that carries the weight and responsibility of preaching and teaching, and it's not just on us. And that's a legacy leadership situation and issue. And so we teach you, it just doesn't happen by happenstance. So we
Right.
teach you how to do that and how to develop a dream team. And so that your church isn't just dependent on your voice.
Yeah, and I was fortunate to get a chance to preach long before I was ready, but I also didn't get feedback. So I didn't know, is this working? Is this not working? That's a great part of this as well. So this is a quote. I love this. This is from Mike, and he says, "May you be encouraged that you're helping a pastor and his congregation and the cause with all your work behind the scenes. I've been using the materials at Preaching Rocket, about a week and a day. I already noticed a difference, and I think the congregation notices too. My wife of many years notices as well." Some of you out there know, as I know, your spouse can be your most honest critic. All right, I'll leave it at that. His encouragement to all of you this week, that's Mike. And so this is what people are talking about. Hey, I think it would be a big deal for you if your spouse noticed a difference in your engagement, energy, and preparation in your preaching. That's pretty cool.
And you don't have to give Preaching Rocket the credit. Just go, I've just been working harder.
Yeah, I've been working harder. I've just become more efficient in my preparation.
That's right.
So this bonus Sunday morning systems, we're going to throw that in when you jump in today, combining creative training, practical resources, and expert interviews. Sunday morning system coaching program will breathe fresh life into your church and help you create beginning to end worship services that your community will talk about. Todd Fields of North Point Community Church and I, we work together on this Sunday morning systems, really from the front end parking lot experience all the way to follow up, and then some of the stuff that Gavin's going to talk about today. So again, what you're going to get, this is Preaching Rocket, and then that's the store price, the bonus system, so $1,994. And what is your weekend and your family life worth to you? This is what Jeff talked about. What if you could feel great about your upcoming sermon? What if you had more time with your kids and family because you have a plan? That's pretty cool. What if you got your weekends back?
Yeah.
What if you could, watch football on Saturday or go to your kids' games or just spend time at home with your family? What would that be worth to you? And so we say this, how much would you pay for a plan, a coach, and 12 months of training, community, strategy, practical help, etc.? You can see why it's a good deal at the price that we listed. But I know you don't have $1,994 sitting around in your leadership development budget. Jeff, maybe you do, maybe you don't.
Right.
I mean,
maybe Gavin does.
Yeah, we understand that when it comes to church budgets, things, you don't just have money laying around everywhere. We understand that, and we respect that. So we brought this down. Jeff talked about bite-sized pieces, $79 a month over 12 months. You can jump into all of this. And Jeff, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions in just a minute. But again, there you go. You can go to thrivethisyear.com. You can get started now. You jump in for $79, or there'll be a link in the chat stream that you can click on. So some Q&A for you, Jeff, right here. I'm a little frozen. There we go. Q&A. We got it. Okay. This is from Greg. How do you develop or strengthen creativity in your approach to series development? That's a great question.
Yeah. Well, I think it does go back, Greg, to the time, and I think we should be preparing for sermons and sermon series every single day. It's not like, okay, now I have an hour from 3 to 4, and now I'm going to be really creative. So a couple of practical strategies that I've used, I just use Evernote or any kind of file would work. And anytime I bump into an idea, I capture it immediately. And that may be been because I'm 50, but I've had a tendency to forget ideas now. I don't know if you do that because Ben's 17 years old. And so I've discovered I got to write it down immediately. So I'll just open up my Evernote file and I'll just write down that idea and I'll just save it so that when I'm doing some sermon prep or series prep, I'll go back and I'll flip through these ideas and go, oh, I forgot about that. That's a good idea. So I would say, Greg, where are you capturing your ideas and how far ahead can you get just looking toward the future? That's one of the reasons we teach you how to develop a 12-month preaching calendar at Preaching Rocket. It doesn't mean that 8 months ahead exactly what you're going to preach that particular sermon, but you could go, you know what, in October, 8 months from now or 9 months from now, I'm going to preach on finances. And then just knowing that, your mind will be thinking financial illustrations, financial stories, so that you can slot that away toward October.
And Jeff, you do a great job of this. Because you have a preaching calendar, you can get creative people involved in the planning process and just say, hey, I would love for you guys to be thinking about this because this is a series we're going to do next month or the month after that.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a staff. It could be people in your church, people that don't go to your church. I know we've brought people in that don't go to our church, don't believe any of this, but we said, we're talking about this. Can you help us brainstorm some ways to illustrate that. So that's a great point.
That's great. Okay, so David says, how long should a series typically be?
Well, and Gavin would tell you this as well. We've kind of all across the board. One summer we did a whole entire series. We all laugh about that and said that was way too long. And so I typically think it's around 3 to 4. I think it starts to wane after about 5 or 6 in terms of the energy. So again, that's just subjective, but I would say probably around the 3 to 4. 2's too short, I think. 3, you're kind of getting there, but ideally I think 4.
That's great. So David asked again, how do you work through the tension of speaking to those that have had faith for years and looking for in-depth teaching versus those young believers who it would go over their head? Is it a delivery issue? Man, that's a great question. I can't wait to hear how you answer that one. So you have people who want in-depth teaching, and so if you cater to them, there's people it's going to go over their head. So how do you kind of work in that tension?
Well, first of all, David, congratulations. The fact that you have this variety in your church is fantastic. I would say part of the challenge in churches nowadays is we just typically right now have those who've been around for years. So the fact that you have young believers who, if you go in depth, it would go over their heads. This is such a great, so first of all, this is a great problem. You never want this problem to go away. If you squash one of these, I think you lose. So for me, I would go back to something we talked about earlier. There are some things here that both of these two groups share, okay? And just because you've been walking with Jesus for years doesn't mean that you have a perfect marriage. So there are issues and topics that you can lean into and go into. Now, that's another reason why on Sunday mornings is a one-step environment, okay? You can also point people to other steps, whether it's small groups, gatherings, whatever, that could speak to this group that's been around for years. But I would make sure that your Sunday mornings is designed not to do too much, but can talk to these two groups and do that one thing.
One more question, okay? Tony says, our biggest struggle has been attracting young couples and developing a young youth group. How can we reach all different ages?
Well, that's a fantastic question, Tony. I would say that the people you put on the platform, those are the kinds of people that you will attract. So I would say, is there someone on your stage? Could you get more younger, maybe create some younger communicators? I'm not sure who's on your stage, but one of the ways that you attract younger people is to have younger communicators. So for example, in our world here at Gwinnett Church, we have a couple of younger communicators that communicate here. And of course, I'm the oldest, so everyone is the younger on our staff. But I love that because they tell different illustrations. They talk about people in music that I have no idea who they are. So if I'm the only one on stage, I'm going to be the kind of people or kind of persons that we're attracting. So if we want to go younger, I've got to make sure that there are younger communicators that can communicate to that audience. And I think you need to program younger. We talk about we want to program younger than what we currently are. So for us, we're trying to program around the mid-30-year-old male. That's how we program Sunday mornings. And there's a lot of strategy behind that. It's not to say that we don't want anyone else, but we feel like if we can get the 35-year-old male, then everyone else will follow. So I would ask the question, Tony, are you programming young, and who's on your platform that can be young as well?
That's great. Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate that.